Boxing Source here with the video, and this one, man. Woo! So we got this news about this thing between Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr., and it's not really looking good for the side of Devin Haney. So apparently, the back and forth between Haney and Gary Russell Jr. has pretty much come to a standstill, as Bill Haney has claimed that DAZN doesn't have the money to put up for a fight between Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr. And I am not necessarily buying that. I'm going to tell you why. Multiple reasons. Number one, even with the whole thing as far as like the pandemic is concerned, the budget has been halted for many of these networks and many of these boxing organizations. So with that being said, that is why a lot of these promotional companies have been able to put together the big fights scheduled for later in the year, because they still have the operating budget, they still have the agreements with the networks. Same case goes here with Matchroom. They do have their operational budget that they still have to work with for the remainder of the year with DAZN. That's why they are able to have fights shown at a later point of this year when it comes to the thing with the World Boxing Super Series, or with matches that involve, Dylan White and Alexander Povetkin. That fight is going to be announced, or the rematch is going to be announced to take place later this year. You're also going to see Anthony Joshua versus Kubrat Pulev later this year on DAZN. So those fights will be on DAZN, like, it's basically been regular. But when it comes to this whole thing with Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr., right? The buzz had been there for over 2 weeks. But then, after, we talked with Gary Russell Jr. last Thursday, after Bill Haney made his comments on Thursday night, we follow up, through Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Now we come to Monday, and apparently DAZN doesn't have the money for a fight between Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney, when Gary Russell Jr. is asking for $1.5 million. So you mean to tell me that they couldn't come up with a purse of, at the most $3 million for that fight to happen? I'm not quite buying that. And the funny part about this is that once Haney's team sent over the contract to Russell, they were pushing for Russell to sign that deal pretty much that day without anyone reviewing it. That's not a good look. That's not how business is conducted. You gotta have an instance where one side is able to review all of the details of whatever the term sheet is, or the contract is, or whatever they're talking about. Because Haney's team was talking about sign the contract, when Russell's side just received the contract. So how is it that you're gonna try to push to have a rush for a fight to be signed when you don't necessarily have all the details, all the ducks in a row? And that is basically what had been admitted to, was that all the ducks weren't in a row on Haney's side, and that Matchroom and DAZN supposedly wasn't backing that fight. But I find that very interesting, given that earlier, or at least what was that, the other day, we received an email through Matchroom Boxing saying that Devin Haney has two possible opponents out there. It's Gary Russell Jr. and Yuriorkis Gamboa. And the thing is, we have seen talks about Devin Haney fighting Yuriorkis Gamboa months ago. And when people initially heard about that being a potential matchup, they didn't like the matchup. And so it looks like they were trying to do some type of cleanup work. Hopefully that's not the case. But it's not really looking too good, because when you have something in place, basically, when you're trying to fight someone or you're about to fight someone, you don't really necessarily talk about them as being your opponent. But all you do is you throw someone out there and say, we don't necessarily like the fight. So they put in other potential opponents that would garner more interest, but the fight itself is not going to happen. And then they turn around and then they sign to fight the guy that they originally intended to fight. Now, there is another kind of fighter that has been rumored to be doing the same thing. Who is in a way involved with Gary Russell Jr., but that's for another time. But right now, we're seeing here that it's not looking all too good for a fight between Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr., because Devin Haney's side, with Bill Haney, of course, Devin Haney's father and trainer, says that DAZN is not interested in the fight, or is not picking up the fight. And I just don't understand that, when that is the most intriguing fight that could be made for Devin Haney at this point. We've had a video earlier this year where we talked about the matchups that were put in place or announced, and that Devin Haney didn't have anything. You had the whole thing with Lomachenko and Lopez. Now that's official. You had the whole thing with Javier Fortuna and Jorge Linares being announced, but with Linares testing positive for COVID-19, that fight had been scrapped. And you had the whole thing with the WBC ordering the final eliminator of sorts between Ryan Garcia and Luke Campbell. So you had Luke Campbell and Ryan Garcia booked. At the time, you had Jorge Linares and Javier Fortuna booked, and they were still setting up the thing for Lomachenko and Teofimo Lopez, and that left Devin Haney without any opponent out there for him to fight. Not Javier Fortuna, who was the top contender for the WBC title that he held. Not Luke Campbell, who he was supposed to fight last year for that WBC title. Not anybody in the lightweight division, except for who they were possibly putting him out there for, with Yuriorkis Gamboa, who lost to Gervonta Tank Davis last December and had that knee, it pretty much torn the ACL during that fight. So we don't know where Yuriorkis Gamboa's condition is at this particular point, but it looks like that is who they are looking to face in a date possibly around November, because it looks like they had a date set for Devin Haney as well. So that is going to be something that we are going to be looking at here over the next couple of days, as it seems like they have an announcement that is scheduled for Devin Haney and who he's going to fight. And if we would have known if it would be Gary Russell Jr. We would have had some type of hints that it was going to be Gary Russell Jr. But over the past day or so, or the past 24 hours, it looks like that whole thing between Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney may have been all for show. But we shall see coming within these next 24 to 48 hours how that is. But in the meantime, you can subscribe to the Boxing Source here on YouTube. You can catch the Boxing Source radio show live Sunday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It's also on iTunes. It's also on Anchor.fm. It's also on Spotify. It's also on Google Podcasts. Just go ahead and listen to that show and follow us on social media through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On that note, folks, I'm out. Peace.